Christian, it's such a pleasure to get to meet you again. And welcome to the Future Life Institute podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on, Max. I'm extremely excited about our conversation today.
So for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of listening to Christian before, she is the president of the National Organization of Women. And maybe you can start by telling us about what this organization is.
Yeah, absolutely. So the National Organization for Women was founded in 1966, and it is the largest, oldest feminist organization in the United States. And it started with a focus on really looking at creating equality for women in all aspects of life, social, economic, political, and just of happiness and equality for life in all generations. And what we do is we work on education and awareness. We work on legislative advocacy, and we are a grassroots organization made up of members and supporters. And our work is really centered on making sure we're looking at it from an intersectional feminist perspective. So when I say that, I mean that we understand how multiple issues and social issues are interconnected. And depending on a person's identity, right, those issues are going to, the multiple issues you have, multiple identities you have, the levels of oppression you experience are going to be compounded and exacerbated worse because of your multiple identities. I work at National Organization for Women, really truly focuses on using multi-issue, multi-strategy approach to making sure we're fighting for true equality for women and girls, and really women and families and gender equality in all aspects. I would say that one of the most important parts of our organization is to make sure that we're, creating narratives and making sure we're uplifting the narratives, marginalized voices, and we're doing truth to power, in the work that we're doing. And we don't back down from that. So we get involved in 6 core issues. And our core issues are ending violence against women, constitutional equality, reproductive rights and freedom, LGBTQIA rights, economic justice, and racial justice. And so that's kind of how we frame the work that we do on those issues, and anything that falls within those 6 core issues is how we govern our policy.
Great stuff. So before we go off and talk about fascinating issues like deepfakes and more broadly artificial intelligence and how it impacts these issues you mentioned, let's talk a little bit more about you first. So can you say a little bit about where you grew up and the arc of your life that took you to the work you do now?
Sure. So the story of my trajectory to being the national president now is very interesting because my background is actually in social work and mental health. But I always tell people it's a very direct trajectory if you really think about it. So I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, and around junior high school, you relocated to Arizona. And so majority of my life, I grew up in Arizona. And I went to undergrad school there, and I got my bachelor's in social work. And then I worked for a little bit before I deferred my mission to grad school, and I worked as a victim advocate, doing domestic violence advocate, and actually the advocate working with the juvenile justice system with those who were victims of sexual abuse and things like that. So I took time off and worked, and that was a really interesting place because I responded to calls of the police. I helped take people to court, develop, orders, helped make sure they understood the court process, really worked really well with victim witness services. And it really gave me a good insight into what really happens with policy and what happens in real life. So as I said, I took a year off, and then I decided I really wanted to work more directly. I went and got my master's, went to New York, went to Columbia University with my master's, and I did clinical work, and I focused on policy, health, mental health, disabilities, really understanding the need to truly make change and impact in communities. You have to kind of get in that community and work on a healing and justice framework. But also in that path, I also still saw the disconnect between what policies and procedures looked like when we say we're offering these policies, procedures, and how they actually play out in real life when you're trying to service communities. Because I still was working as a community organizer outside of my actual career. So just from being a community organizer, eventually got involved with NOW again and kind of worked my way up through from local to state to national. And so now that I'm on the side of being the national president, it is an opportunity for me to be able to communicate, saying these are where the disconnects are in these policies. These are the disconnects in these bills, because a lot of times we sometimes, and I don't think it's intentional, Max, but I think what happens is, when we're thinking about how people write policy, sometimes they forget the person in the process, like they leave the person out of it. And that's problem. But we see that when you're working directly with people, you see where they forgot about trauma, how trauma impacts a person, or what are these marginalized communities are experiencing. So it's been really helpful for me to have that experience now leading the organization, because I'm able to really talk about and identify those disconnects in legislation and really help communicate how we can make it better and better informed to really service people.
Fascinating. Yeah. So we are, of course, very, very excited that you and the National Organization of Women has joined this bandeepfakes.org campaign to rein in deepfakes. Could you say a little bit about why your organization decided to support this campaign and what you see the relationship between this deepfake problem and in particular women's issues? Why this is a women's issue?
Yeah, well, first, I want to thank you for even approaching National Organization for Women with the opportunity to join this campaign. And when we talk about what's happening, we talk about gender-based violence, when we talk about ending violence against women, we have to really think about it in the year 2024, right? Before, we wanted to only think about it in terms of, intimate partner violence, direct intimate partner violence, like, physical abuse, emotional abuse, partner sexual abuse, things like that. But in this new day and age, it has expanded and changed completely different. And we know social media has a major impact on so many people's lives. And we're talking about relationships, and we're talking about assault and harassment and stalking and gender-based harassment and stalking. We have to have that conversation of what that looks like. We're talking about in technology, AI, social media, and what that has caused. And it is a direct correlation between cyber-related harassment that leads down the pathway to actually physical harassment as well. And the harms are just as traumatic. They're just as detrimental. They're just as life-altering. So we can't have a conversation about protecting women or truly figuring out how do we provide full protections for women and create safe spaces for women if we're not having a conversation about deepfakes at all and AI, because we know that majority of deepfakes that are created on women are sexual in nature. They're deepfake porn, right? And then on top of that, we hear about a lot of celebrity cases, but we don't realize that majority of 99% of those cases are marginalized persons and when people who don't have the means and the money to be able to make that fight, right? So they're silenced again. So now we're marginalizing another community within this AI, social media space. So this deepfake ban campaign was so important because you all take it a step further, which I was really happy to see. You don't just say hold the person who perpetrated the violence accountable. You also hold the tech firms, the tech companies, the developers, everyone who's part of creating an environment and an ecosystem for abuse, toxicity, violence, gender-based violence accountable. Because if they did not have that means, to be able to create the abuse, it wouldn't exist, right? So it's kind of like, it's like by you saying, we got to think about why we're not holding these people accountable. And I was like, I'm so glad they finally did that, right? Because so many people haven't done that. They just kind of disregard the fact that, hey, if this person didn't create this app and this, the platform didn't if they don't put them off and take away their privileges, then they don't have the opportunity to continue to abuse people and abuse women. So that's one of the main reasons why we decided to sign on to this campaign, is because we see how you all are being holistic in your approach and understanding that everyone has to come and be involved in this. Everyone has to get involved in protecting women. It's not the responsibility of only the women and children and men and LGBT or non-conforming gender identified by people as well. It is a responsibility for everyone to make sure that they are doing their best to provide a safe space in ending violence. And that includes whether it's in-person, physical, or cyber-related.
Now, that's such a good point you're making there, that the people who create most of these sexual abuse deepfakes, they're often 14-year-old boys, who absolutely don't have the technical skills to create and build their own AI tools to do it. Which means if you can put guardrails and liability on the companies who provide these tools, it really make a huge difference for the better. Now, and I'm also really glad you brought up this fact that it's not just very high-profile celebrities like Taylor Swift who are victimized, but the vast majority of the victims are actually teenagers and other very vulnerable people who are not super famous, who most people haven't heard of. So how can we give voice to them? How can we make more of their stories become well known so that the people appreciate this point that it's not just Taylor Swift?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Well, it goes back to making sure that we're always centering those who are directly impacted, right? So as we're doing these campaigns, as we're pushing these bills, that we're making sure that we are also going to those survivor-based organizations and groups and coalitions that are doing this work and making sure we're reaching out to them and asking them, like, from your experience, from those survivors, from those victims, what do they think about this? So they feel like this is encompassing everything they need. What else do you feel like would have helped in your situation? So we're really taking consideration what they believe will be beneficial for this because they've lived it. They know firsthand. And it's always important that we're always uplifting their narrative and their voice in this too, first, more than anything. So I think that's one way we definitely can do it is always make sure there's several seats at the table, not just one, but several seats at the table for those who are living this, experiencing this, and, directly impacted activists and advocates and survivors so that there's a good, enriched conversation about what needs to happen and things that happen that sometimes we don't know about because we think we know about everything. But, people who've gone through this can tell you a little bit more about some of the technicalities and some of the unspokens about their experiences. And so when we included them, we have better ways to be preventative, but also to find solutions for, creating safety and healing for those people. So I would say that. And the other thing I would say is, this is not about trying to punish anybody, but, really thinking about, like, how do we create our societies the way that we really want them to be. If we're always saying that we want to leave our world in a place where, our legacies and our futures have a place to grow and be safe and well and healthy. Well, what are we doing to make sure that's happening? Because right now, what they're facing is abuse online, predators online, exposure to all kinds of things that they don't need exposure to before their brains can possibly even fully understand, development-wise, what's going on. And so, like, as you said, a 14-year-old boy might take their friend or some girl that, or boy that he liked and, make a graphic about them because they're upset they broke up with them. How do you, now they don't understand the consequences of that. They're young, they're acting impulsively, and there's no one educating them about that. So we have so much work to do, and I think that's why there has to be education campaigns at school about this. There has to be work with, schools, survivors. Everyone has to be brought to this table to make sure we're solving this.
So I'm curious actually what kind of support networks there are out there right now, if there's anything you can share with us. For example, there are, of course, some support networks out there for survivors of sexual assault and so on, but are there any support networks that you know of for that someone who has been just found out that they're the victim of deepfake sexual abuse that they can reach out to? Could you speak a little bit about what the situation is there?
So I don't know of any that are specifically designed just for deepfake sexual abuse, but I do know there's RAINN, there's Joyful Heart. Those are the two main ones. I would say RAINN is a really popular hotline that everyone, RAINN, and that's a popular hotline that everyone goes to when they've experienced any type of abuse. There's also Joyful Heart Foundation that provides resources. So there are ones out there that exist when we're talking about experiences of, sexual abuse and harassment and things like that. But I would have to probably look and find out. But I have not heard myself personally one that's specifically designed for just cyber flashing or deepfake AI or anything like that. But it is going to probably become a need, because it's a very different, nuanced type of experience that people are going to have. And it's going to be something that I think we're going to have to eventually start addressing sooner than later.
Yeah, so that was RAINN.org for anyone watching this who has been victimized or knows someone. Yeah, I think this is a really important point you raised, because when something like this happens, one wants to make it really easy for the victim, not just to find someone who can talk to them, who actually understands the technical aspects of what happened and so on, and can help them contextualize and get support, but also practical things like we can tell them how can they report this, who do they report it to, what do they do, and maybe can help follow up also, because it's so new. I have a strong concern that much of this just completely slips through the cracks of the system. And that's also a segue to talking about the current legislative situation. I know you do a lot of wonderful work where you go educate policymakers in Washington and elsewhere about things. Do you want to say a little bit about how you see the current situation there with legislatively on this, and also how much support or not you feel you get from the policymakers when you talk to them about the deepfakes?
Well, I'm actually quite encouraged by the current legislators and Congress in their proactivity or how they're engaged right now with trying to address deepfakes. There's two bills there's this bill on the Senate side and there's a bill on the House side that are, they've been rolling around. And I think there's a third one coming out, but I'm not quite sure, that are, really working on addressing, deepfakes and the influence and the impact they're having, and making sure there's like some guardrails in place and things like that. It's some accountability. And so that's the Defiance Act. And that's from the Senate side. And that stands for Disrupting Explicit Forged Images and Non-Consensual Edits Act 2024. So this one is guaranteeing that there are provisions to stop the continued growth of these non-consensual images, edited images, right? Deepfakes. And then also to have some guardrails in place when it does happen, and make sure there's ways to address it. And on the on U.S. House side, Congressional U.S. House side, there is the Preventing Deepfakes of Intimate Images Act. So that's one coming from Orwell's office. And that's another one that's really important. And pretty much very similar language. I mean, not exactly the same language, but the exact same point, like making sure there is accountability, make sure there's protection, making sure we're doing what we can to create safeguards and accountability and things like that. So the fact that there's two, and then there's also some other cyber flashing ones that kind of have some mixed languages with cyber flashing, deepfake porn, revenge, some other ones that are kind of lingering around that have some mixed language. So to me, I think that they're really taking this and making sure they're pushing this. And I would say that has bipartisan support. Everyone's concerned about protecting children. Everyone's concerned about protecting, the most vulnerable. And these bills are seeing bipartisan support, which is great. And so the likelihood of these getting through, I think, is going to be really positive, and I'm optimistic about it. And I want to just encourage everyone how you can be active if you care about somebody or somebody who's been affected, is to call your congressional member, and talk to them about why you support these pieces of legislation and why you think, you want people to vote for them and, make sure they pass, because we have to start getting more active in protecting, women and children.
It's really heartening that this is still such a bipartisan issue. It's getting harder and harder to think of any bipartisan issue, frankly, these days.
Yes.
And yet, here I saw this recent poll where about 90% of Democrats and about 90% of Republicans want to really crack down hard on deepfakes. I can't think of any other issue at this point that's so bipartisan. And so it's really great that you're trying to push them across the finish line and not just walk talk the talk but walk the walk and pass some laws here.
Right. And next, I think it also shows like when we're really talking about, protecting children and making sure that vulnerables are like not targeted and harassed, I think people will eventually start thinking about how that issue impacts them in their life and their family. And nobody wants their sister or their child, or their loved one to be a victim of that. And they know the damage it can do. So I really think that's what's driving this bipartisan support. Like, we all know that when something's out there in the World Wide Web, how difficult it is to get it removed and taken down. And then how it just turns into this like metamorphosed, like continued image on and on and on and on and on. And, there's already a problem with people taking people's images and making memes out of them anyways without their consent. We've already got to the age where people have their cameras out and are recording people without them knowing and using them for laughter. And just, it's a lot of problems we're having where people are being non-consensual images of people. And this, I'm not talking about porn, but it's non-consensual images people are floating through the internet. And they don't understand the impact that has on a person's life when that person has been ridiculed or mimicked or become a laughing stock or used to just to gain likes or gain attention. And so when you already had that and you add in now the compounded part with turning it into a sexualized thing and not understanding the impact of what sexualizing something for a woman it turns into and how people misread cues without all the time. And people don't understand if that person did it or not, and they don't care. And then now you're adding to a whole nother layer of trauma. You're adding to another layer of abuse. And every time that image comes out, that person's being re-traumatized. They can't get past it. They can't get over it. There's something they're going to have circulate in their life for a very long time. So we really have to crack down on this. We can't keep allowing people's lives to be affected and altered without their consent, without their knowledge, just because we think it's funny or because we're angry or because someone set their boundaries.
Couldn't agree more. And it was great to get your overview there of the many legislative efforts also, so people watching or listening to this podcast can see what's going on and reach out and encourage their senators or congressmen to push ahead with this. We'll put a link in the chat to a very nice little summary graphic that my FLI colleague Alexandra has made, summarizing all the latest efforts so people can see how much is going on. And
just a name for the Defiance Act, it's led by Durbin, Graham, Klobuchar, Hawley, and Hawley. So those, are the ones who are leading that Defiance Act. And Morrell's leading the one on the U.S. House side. So just want to put those names out there so we know kind of who are the leading individuals are leading those acts and things like that.
Great. And when looking through all of them, it's interesting, even though there are some of them that I think can be made stronger. What I found very encouraging, Christian, here was that if you take the strongest parts from all the different bills and put them together, you actually get all of the key things that our campaign is asking for. Go after the whole supply chain, emphasize that the deepfake is something that's non-consensual, et cetera, and the more these policymakers feel support from their constituents and elsewhere, the more likely it will probably be that they'll take the best parts from all the different acts and pass something good. And we've spoken very much now on the horrible use of AI to make non-consensual sexual abuse, but of course, in addition to that, as if that wasn't bad enough, we also have massive explosion in deepfake fraud, which is up 1,600% year on year. Some mother got called up in California about what she thought was her daughter, said she had been kidnapped. It was all fake. A lot of companies are losing a lot of money through deepfake scams. A lot of the older people are really being heavily victimized by someone calling them up who they think is a relative and it's not. And then politicians, of course, who are also feeling this thing quite directly with deepfakes of them, which can undermine democracy. So in a way, it feels like maybe the perfect storm is brewing. How hopeful are you that this perfect storm can actually lead to some legislation?
I'm hopeful. I don't know if it'll happen before this election. I'm hoping it does, though. Actually, I'm really hoping it does because I think it's important that it happens as soon as possible because exactly what you just named, like people are being scammed. There's the fraud level, the scam level is affecting people's livelihoods, right? So that goes into the whole economic realm of this and how we are witnessing people who are on disability, people who are on retirement, even people who just really are, have all levels of income have been affected by this, getting these voices or these messages or these texts or whatever, pretending to be someone they know. And actually, I'll share, my line got created and someone was sending out messages from my phone, one of my numbers.
Wow.
And someone texted me and said, did you just text me and ask me for this? I said, that was not me. Please delete this now. So I just sent a message out and saying this, if you got a text message from me, this was not me, And the problem is this is where it lies. If someone trusts you as a person, right? They think you're a trustworthy person, then they're going to trust what you ask them for. Or if they have a good relationship with you, they're going to trust what you ask them for, and they're going to just do it because they trust you, right? And so this has just happened. And I was like, well, why wouldn't they call me? But then I thought, and they said, I didn't think I needed to call you. And I was like, that makes sense. And this is what's happening. This is what we're seeing, right? Because why? They trust me. They know I'm a person of good character. They know I would never ask, and I had no idea that happened. And I had to go through this whole scrubbing thing and figure out what's going on in my mind. And, but this is happening. And then I know someone else whose mother was scammed out of a lot of money, and to the point where she's already on a very limited income, and she was scammed out a lot of money and actually borrowed money to help this person when she didn't have it because of these deepfakes. And, that's how serious this is. So people are getting into debt over deepfakes. They're getting into debt from the fraud. It's affecting people's relationships. I mean, it's a horrible thing that is causing a lot of chaos. And so this is why the need for more legislation, to look at it, I think, Max, it needs to be looked at from a holistic perspective, right? How does it impact us on, we're talking about sexualized images, right? That's one. But then also you're talking about fraud. That's another. Academic, that's another. Professional. I mean, we have to look at it all the way around about how this deepfake and AI really truly start impacting people's ability to have successful and sustainable lives. How is it really going in there and impacting it? And then what do we need to do for legislation that can address that? Because as long as we keep piecemealing it, we're going to miss something. So the best way is to get some legislators together, sit down at a table, let's talk it out, let's bring it down and say, let's look at this as a whole person. What would be the most devastating places that this deepfake can impact them, that could be the most devastating for them, that can affect their ability, their housing, their ability to pay their bills, their relationships with their families, and just look at it, the harassment, and then so how do we connect this, and how do we put parts in this legislation that's going to hit all sorts of different areas? This is where I believe, and this is my social work background, is that we have to start looking at things from an ecosystem perspective, where we're looking at, okay, this part, what's going on. And the center of the person is the core, or the center of our community is the core, or the center of the issue is the core. But how do we look at all these things that are connected to them, and how are they going to impact them? And then that's how we start building out this legislation and this bill, so that we're connecting every single piece and we're not missing anything. Like you're saying, if we keep just doing it piecemeal, though, we're going to leave something out. And when we leave those things out, then, or like you said earlier, like when one bill put pieces of all of them, you get this one great bill. So that's part of what we have to do. And I think we have to really look at that, because I'm really afraid for this fraud. I'm afraid that people are already in a place of feeling like they can barely survive, or they're, struggling, or they're in a place of just feeling like what this world is kind of like a fragile place, and our democracy is a fragile place. It's another way of silencing people. You take away their actual consent. And this is what deepfake is doing, is taking away people's consent. So that's another way of silencing.
So I guess one synthesis of what you said there would be zooming out to the big picture and not being piecemeal is that one should not just pass a bill saying that it cracks down on deepfakes that are doing fraud, or a bill that just does deepfakes for non-consensual sexual abuse, or that can affect elections, but rather go after them all at once and say, no, deepfake is simply something which can be taken as real and of someone and you don't have their consent for it, regardless of whether it's for fraud or sexual abuse or throwing an election. The laws should catch all of this, and then also as to the last thing you said there about taking away people's consent. If you think about it can we think about this maybe as a fundamental right, in the same sense that we believe that we should have a right to our own beliefs, our right to believe in have whatever religion we want, etc. That we should also have a right to our own identity, and that people can't just take our identity and do whatever they want with it.
Well, it is about bodily autonomy, right? So it is kind of one of our rights. I mean, or one of our human rights. And so it's kind of, is that we have bodily autonomy, free agency, and we can't have free agency if we have deepfakes taking that from us. So yes, I agree with that. As for one big piece of legislation, I don't think I want to just say, well, let me just go back and say that I'm very happy for the legislation that's out there. I'm very happy for what they're doing. I'm so happy. I'm so thankful. I have endorsed it. now has endorsed it. As an organization, we have endorsed it. I personally endorse it. I'm very happy about it. And I think that that's okay to get down to defining them a little bit more specific, but I think it still needs to be one overall, like we're talking about, one overall like bill that just is really targeting the whole issue of deepfakes and what that is, what deepfake really is, breaking it down. Because sometimes I think when people hear deepfakes, they automatically just assume it's deepfake porn. They don't understand how it manifests in other areas. So if you create one piece of legislation that just really bans deepfakes in general, which is non-consensual, right? Taking away bodily autonomy, taking away your free agency. Then when you can do that, then the other ones that fall under that umbrella are going to be more reinforceable, because you have this one piece that just basically explains what it is and says, this is not okay. We ban this. This is against the law to have deepfakes. They're non-consent. We don't support non-consent. And then the other ones will be more enforceable, and you can have your more resources, you know what I'm saying, like going from there.
Yeah, that sounds very promising. And just on an optimistic note, it's worth just mentioning, I think, that this can be perfectly consistent with the First Amendment and free speech. And because if one simply bans things which are non-consensual and cannot, and a reasonable person could actually believe are real, right? Then satire of the really funny kind, like The Onion, is still allowed, but it completely eliminates the deepfake sexual abuse, it eliminates the fraud and the political impact. I wanted to also, just so people don't get too depressed by thinking that it has to always take forever to have impact. Do you think that even if it takes a while to pass the laws, people just seeing statements from policymakers on both sides of the aisle saying, yeah, we support this, we're going to do it, and seeing these, that when tech companies, for example, see the writing on the wall that this is coming down the pike, that they might actually start taking some action, cracking down on it long before the laws come?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it will. I think it's important that motion starts happening before the laws pass. And I also think it's important that everyone starts reaching out to those tech companies and start having conversations about how can we assist you to do so. Before it gets to accountability, how can we help you make sure that you're doing your part in preventing this, and being accountable? I think that's an important conversation to have too. So how do we pull you in and into the solution before we, more than anything? So it doesn't have to get to a place of accountability, because you've bought into it. You understand that you can still be successful as a tech company, but still not allow some things to occur within within your company. So, and the more I think there's education awareness about this, it also helps with the members of Congress, pushing forward and their understanding and willingness of why this is important and why it needs to pass. but it helps empower the community as well about what they can do in their communities to provide supports, like we were talking about earlier, provide supports and resources for those impacted.
Before we finish, maybe we could come back to this even bigger picture that you were talking about earlier here and just zoom out a little more broadly and look at the impact of AI on society and on your work. So I'm wondering if at the end here, you wanted to say a little bit about more broadly how now issues of transparency, fairness, bias, and AI, what are the things that you feel are most important here, things that you'd like to see done, guardrails you'd like to see put in place?
So now is just now getting into this area of work with AI. But one thing what's important to us that I think threads through our values and our mission is protecting and creating a safe space for women, right? And so when we think about why this is important for us, the organization, it's because it creates more avenues to make sure and legislation and advocacy to guarantee that in all aspects that for creating justice and fairness, we're looking at it from everywhere that it might impact the woman's life, right? I would say big on transparency, and we're also big on we have to make sure that we're doing our part to go from education all the way to the top. It's like we're grassroots based, and so we understand the power of the community and empower people, and that's a big part of how this organization is founded. So for us, that talks to centering communities, that talks to reaching out to your congressional members and letting them know what's happening in your communities, that talks about having relationships and coalition building and movement building. Those are the things that our organization is known for. And so when we had these conversations about AI and we had these conversations about the work in this space, it makes sense because we recognize that this is affecting our community and and the community that we serve. So if we're looking at how do we continue to protect the community, we have to include this in the conversation.
Great, Christian. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to have this conversation with me. Thank you so much for the wonderful work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me on, and we look forward to continue work with you on the campaign.